A Little Me was published in June of 2019. Chris Marek proposed to Amy Roloff in September of 2019, 3 months apart, which means the definitive account of Amy Roloff's life, written by Amy Roloff, went to print without the ending. She wrote the whole thing not knowing whether the man she was dating would ask, whether she would say yes, whether the second chapter of her life was going to work out at all. The last pages leave her hopeful and unresolved, dating a realtor from West Lynn, with no idea that a heart-shaped diamond was 12 weeks away. Almost nobody writes a memoir from that position. Celebrity memoirs are usually retrospective by design. You wait until the story has a shape, then you tell it. Amy did the opposite. She wrote from inside the uncertainty. That decision explains a great deal about the book, and it is the best place to start. Look first at where she took it. She skipped New York entirely. She went to Indigo River Publishing, a small Christian-oriented press based in Pensacola, Florida. That was a choice, and it cost her something. A New York imprint would have brought a larger advance, a publicity department, review placements, and the machinery that turns a book into an event. Indigo River could not offer any of that at the same scale. What Indigo River could offer was a publisher who would not fight her about the framing. Understand what a big commercial house would have wanted from this manuscript. They would have wanted the divorce. They would have wanted the phone. They would have wanted the Caryn Chandler material foregrounded, the faith material trimmed, and a title with more edge than A Little Me. That is not cynicism about publishing. It is publishing. Acquisition editors buy books they can position, and the positionable book here was the betrayal narrative. Amy did not want to write that book. She wanted to write a Christian memoir about worth and identity that happened to contain a difficult marriage. So she went to a publisher whose entire list was built for exactly that. Simon Schuster came in later on distribution, which got the hardcover into major retail chains and gave it reach Indigo River could not have generated alone. Amy got the arrangement most first-time authors would want: editorial control from a small house, shelf space from a large one. The physical book ran 278 pages in hardcover, with a dust jacket and proper design. Later editions appeared as DRM-protected EPUB. The hardcover ISBN is 9781948080910, which is the number to search if you want a clean copy rather than waiting through a decade of listings. There is one more thing the timing did to the book, and it is not a flaw. Memoirs written after the resolution are shaped by it, whether the author intends that or not. Once you know how a story ends, you cannot help writing the earlier chapters as though they were leading somewhere. Every hard year becomes preparation. Every wrong turn becomes necessary. The whole thing acquires a tidiness that the life did not have while it was being lived. Amy could not do that because she did not have the ending. The difficult years in her book are allowed to be simply difficult. They are not retroactively justified by a wedding she did not yet know about. That gives the account a rawness that a 2022 version of the same book would have lost entirely. Now the sentence the whole thing is built on: God does not make mistakes. Gordon Knight said it to his daughter throughout her childhood. Not once, not at a crisis point, but continuously, across years, whenever Amy came home carrying something she could not put down. She was the only one of the 4 Knight children born with achondroplasia. She was growing up in the greater Detroit area in the 1960s and 70s, in a country that had not yet had most of the conversations it would later have about disability. Whatever a schoolyard could do to a small child who was visibly different, it did, and her father kept saying the same thing: "You are not a mistake. You were made this way on purpose. There is nothing here that needs fixing." That sentence became the load-bearing wall of Amy's identity and the through line of the entire memoir. Every chapter routes back to it. It sits in the marketing copy. It appears in nearly every review. Readers who dislike the book usually dislike it because of how often that sentence returns. It is worth noticing what the sentence does and does not claim, because it is more precise than it first appears. It is not a promise that things will improve. It is not a claim that suffering has a purpose, which is the version of religious consolation that tends to make people angry when they are actually suffering. It says something narrower, that the person is not defective. For a child with achondroplasia in that period, that was the relevant question. Every message she received from the world outside her house implied that her body was an error to be corrected, worked around, or pitied. Her father was contradicting that specific message and nothing else, which is probably why it held. Broad promises about everything working out fail the first time something does not. A claim about your own worth is harder to disprove. The structure is chronological and moves at a steady pace. The Michigan chapters are the ones fan reviewers most often call painful. Amy does not soften what happened to her. She writes about the shame she carried as a child. She admits to periods when she wished, badly, to be different. She covers a serious illness that hit her as a young girl, layering a second physical crisis on top of the one she was born with. She writes about bullying and about body image and about beauty ideals she could never meet and spent decades measuring herself against anyway. She does not write those chapters as a woman who has fully resolved all of it. She writes them as a woman who found a workable answer and still has to reapply it. The middle chapters lift. Central Michigan University, studying business, friendships, academic difficulty she pushed through, the slow reconstruction of a self-image, from disabled child to capable young woman with a future. Then 1987, and a Little People of America conference, and a man from California named Matt Roloff. Here's the detail from the courtship that stops most readers cold. She saw him 4 times before they were married. 4. That is not 4 dates spread across a year. That is 4 occasions total between meeting and marrying. They wed on September 12, 1987. She was 24, he was 25. Set that against the 5 years she and Chris Merrick later spent circling each other before the 2021 wedding, and the contrast is almost too neat. The same woman, 30 years apart, running 2 opposite strategies. The book does not moralize about it, and Amy has never framed those 4 meetings as a mistake. She describes the whole thing as feeling inevitable once they had connected. There is a reading of those 4 meetings that is less romantic and more practical, and Amy's own account supports it. The dwarfism community in 1987 was not large, and it was not easy to move around in. There was no internet. A young little person in Michigan looking to meet other little people had essentially one route, the Little People of America conference circuit, which happened annually, in a different city, for a few days at a time. So 4 meetings may not indicate recklessness. It may indicate the maximum available. If the only occasions 2 people can be in the same room are national conferences, then 4 occasions represents a substantial investment of years, not a whirlwind. That context does not make a 1987 wedding after 4 encounters ordinary. It does make it comprehensible. The early marriage chapters are warm. Twins Zach and Jeremy in January of 1990, Molly in September of 1993, Jacob in January of 1997, 34 acres in Helvetia bought in 1990. The grinding, satisfying work of turning that ground into an operation while raising 4 children on it. Then 2006 and TLC, and the peculiar experience of becoming a national television figure in her 40s. What is striking about that portion is how little of it is about television. The show arrived in 2006 and dominated the family's public identity for 18 years. And in the memoir, it is one development among many rather than the organizing fact of her life. That is a deliberate proportion. Amy is writing about a woman who had a childhood, a degree, a marriage, 4 children, and a farm, and who then also happened to end up on television. The show is a chapter. It is not the subject. Most reality memoirs invert that, because the show is why the publisher signed the author. Amy had a publisher who let her keep the proportions she wanted. Then the book turns. Amy writes about tensions that accumulated over years rather than arriving in a single event. Personality differences that were manageable at 25 and were not at 50. Matt's ambition, which she had found attractive when they were young, coming to feel overwhelming. His projects taking him further from the house. His evenings shifting toward local bars and taverns. And then the passage that made this a news story. Amy writes about seeing messages and photographs on Matt's phone that she believed indicated an inappropriate closeness with Caryn Chandler, the farm manager, while the marriage was still intact. She writes about being frightened, ashamed, and uncertain what to do with what she had seen. She writes about holding it for years before she confronted him. The separation followed in March of 2014. The divorce was finalized 2 years after that. Those pages are the reason the book got national coverage. They are also contested, and any honest account has to say so plainly. Matt pushed back publicly after publication. He said the framing was unfair to him. He denied a physical affair during the marriage. He has never accepted Amy's characterization of that period. Both accounts exist. Neither has ever been adjudicated anywhere. What the memoir gives readers is Amy's version, set down deliberately, under her own name, which is a different thing from a tabloid claim, and also a different thing from established fact. Readers should hold it as exactly what it is: one participant sworn to account of a private marriage disputed by the other participant. It is also worth being clear about what a memoir can and cannot do here. A memoir is not evidence in any formal sense. It is testimony, unchallenged, published by one side. That does not make it worthless. Amy attached her name to it and accepted whatever consequences followed, which is a meaningfully different act from an anonymous source briefing a tabloid. But it does mean readers should not treat the pages as settled history simply because they are printed and bound. The people who were actually in that marriage, number 2. One of them wrote a book. The other gave interviews disagreeing with it. That is the entirety of the public record, and it is unlikely to grow. The closing chapters recover. She writes about the disorientation of single life after 29 years, about being frightened of dating, about walking into a paint and sip singles mixer in late 2016 and meeting Chris Merrick. And then it stops, because that is where she was when the manuscript closed. The book has no wedding, it has no proposal, it has no resolution at all, only a woman with reasonable grounds for optimism. That incompleteness is a weakness in structural terms, and it is the book's most honest feature. Amy had every commercial reason to wait. Publish 18 months later, and she could have delivered a memoir with a happy ending and sold considerably more copies. She published anyway, at the point she had reached, without knowing. One formal device divides readers more than anything else in the book. Each chapter closes with a short section called Amy's Thoughts. She steps out of the narrative, summarizes what the chapter taught her, and addresses the reader directly with the lesson. Some readers found these the most valuable part of the book, the practical application, the bit you could underline and come back to. Others found them repetitive, and several reviewers said the return to God does not make mistakes had begun to wear thin by the later chapters. Both reactions are defensible, and they are really a disagreement about what the book is for. If you came for a life story, the reflections interrupt it. If you came for something to apply to your own life, they are the point. Amy is a professional motivational speaker. That is not a side activity. It is a significant part of her income. Amy's Thoughts is a speaker's instinct on the page. Deliver the story, then deliver the takeaway. Because an audience that leaves without one has not got what it paid for. There is a further reason the reflections exist, and it has to do with who Amy expected to be reading. Her audience is not primarily literary. It is women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who have watched her on television for years and who are dealing with their own divorces, their own difficult children, their own bodies not doing what they used to. Those readers did not buy a memoir for the prose. They bought it because a woman they trust had been through something and might have something usable to say about it. Ending each chapter with the usable part is a reasonable response to that audience. It is not how a literary memoirist would build a book. Amy was not writing for literary memoir readers. Reception was mixed and broadly favorable. Reviewing it, the New York Journal of Books found it warm and inspirational, praising a woman who meets difficulty directly, with optimism and a deep faith. Jack Morrissey, a producer on Disney's Beauty and the Beast, endorsed it as a powerful story about a faithful spirit. Chester Goad, himself an author and speaker, singled out how unguarded it was. Reader ratings ran the expected spread. 5 stars from committed LPBW fans who had waited years for her side of it. 2 and 3 stars from readers who wanted more depth in particular chapters, or who found the reflections repetitive by the halfway mark. The one thing nearly everybody agreed on is that it sounds like her. The voice on the page is the voice from the show and from the podcast and from the cooking videos. Whether that worked for a given reader mostly depended on whether they already liked that voice. Commercially, It did respectably rather than spectacularly. No runaway bestseller. What it got instead was a long tail, and that tail turned out to matter more than the first-year figures. A Little Me has become the source book. Articles written about Amy draw on it. Tabloid coverage of the Matt and Amy and Caryn situation quotes it. Any serious biographical account of her has to either use the book or argue with it, because there is nowhere else to go. That is what happens to a memoir when it is the only first-person account in existence. It stops being a book. It becomes the record. It also fixed something that had been drifting for years. Before 2019, the public account of the Roloff marriage came almost entirely from edited television and from whatever either party said in a given interview. Confessional segments are cut. Interviews are steered. Neither produces a continuous version of events. The book gave Amy a continuous version. Whatever anyone thinks of its claims, it exists in one piece, in her own words, in an order she chose. That is worth something to a person who had spent 13 years being assembled by other people's editing. Her life has moved a considerable distance past the last page. Engaged in September 2019. Married in August 2021. 8 grandchildren. Little People, Big World finished after 25 seasons. Matt's engagement to Caryn ended in July of 2025. None of that is in the book. All of it happened to a woman who had already published her life story. Whether a sequel comes is unknown. She has the material, a second marriage, the end of the show, the cooking business, 8 grandchildren, and the collapse of her ex-husband's engagement. She has announced nothing, and her attention has gone to cookbooks and speaking. What she has instead is a memoir that ends mid-sentence, published by a woman who decided her story was worth telling before she knew whether it turned out well. There is a case that this makes it the better book. A sequel written now would arrive with everything settled, married, grandmother of 8, business running, show finished, ex-husband's engagement collapsed. It would be a victory lap, and victory laps make dull reading. The 2019 version has no idea any of that is coming. It is a 56-year-old woman with a broken marriage behind her, a new relationship she is not sure about, and one sentence from her father to hold on to. That is a considerably more interesting position to write from than the one she occupies today. Have you read A Little Me, and what stayed with you? Does it change how you read the book to know she published it 3 months before the proposal? And do you think a sentence like, "God does not make mistakes," is genuinely load-bearing for someone in difficulty, or too simple for what adult life actually throws at people?